Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. Hope you've all had a really great week. Hope you're all staying safe and healthy and well. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we are going to be discussing why leaders fail, especially in terms of leading through crisis. My name is Adrian. I am a principal consultant and psychologist here at Peterberry Consultancy. It's been a really absolute pleasure to be doing a few of these webinars, sharing some of our thoughts and insights with regards to team functioning, leadership, and other aspects of workforce talent. So just a few things before we get started this afternoon. Our moderator, Jaja, is available, and she is just collecting some of the questions throughout the webinar. So if there's anything that we discuss that sparks a thought or a question, feel free to add any of those questions into the chat function. Jaja will be collating some of those questions, and we'll spend some time towards the end answering those as best as we can. In addition to that, if you haven't already, we'd love for you to share your contact details directly with Jaja, our moderator, just so she can give any additional information or material off the back of our webinar if that's something that you would be interested in. We're not going to share your contact details with anybody else. That's really just for us to ensure that we're capturing your attendance and supporting you as best that we can. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for the housekeeping. Let's get into the webinar. So what we're going to be discussing today and what we're going to be talking about is really what we want in our leaders. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you've probably already read and heard about through various articles and research. But then we're going to really look at the other side of the coin. What is the impact of poor leadership, not just in crisis, but generally? We're going to explore a little bit more detail around how leaders respond to crises and exactly what failed leadership looks like in the context of a crisis. We'll then talk a little bit more about how leaders can better manage their dark side tendencies, and we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by the dark side. And finally, we'll open it up to some questions that we can hopefully answer. So to start off with, what is a crisis? And there's a few sort of definitions, there's a few ways of describing it or defining it, but really one of them is any sort of time of intense difficulty or danger. It can also be described as an event that is going or that is going to lead to unstable or dangerous situations. It impacts on individuals, groups, communities, essentially the whole society, and often that event is unexpected. And the negative change in security, economic, political, societal, environmental affairs, especially when those changes occur quite abruptly or with very little warning. So I think it's pretty safe to say that as a civilization here in Australia, across the world, we are very much experiencing some of these things. So for a couple of minutes, I just want you to think, reflect on some of the things that you've read over the last few weeks, months, maybe some things that you heard across the news in terms of how leadership around the world has responded to the current situation of the coronavirus. So think of a leader, right? Think of a leader that you've heard in terms of their addresses. Think about a leader that you've read about in terms of their behavior in response to the current environment. Now, depending on whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person, you're probably thinking of various individuals. So if we look at some of the behavior that we've read about recently, some leaders have demonstrating some behaviors around covering up warnings and alerts, going as far as to punishing people who have raised alarm bells. We've also seen leaders really step up and be really transparent in the way that they communicate and really move to quite decisive action. You can see that there are other leaders that maybe downplay the severity of the threats, dismissing concerns from subject matter experts. On the bright side, there's some leaders out there, they're stating facts, they're being realistic, they're really telling it as it is, and they're delivering a really firm message. And then you've got leaders that are a bit more withholding of information, maybe making ill-informed decisions. So you can see here a huge variety of different behaviors, some really productive, some that have led to really positive outcomes, others not so much. So if we concentrate firstly on what works, what is it that we look for and want and need in leaders during a crisis? Often calmness and resilience comes up, and that's not just anecdotally. I think when we look at the research more broadly, leaders who are calm, who are resilient, who have that composure are able to make those decisions free of emotionality. The other thing that we look for is leaders who are going to take the initiative. They're proactive in taking charge of a situation. So often people are going to turn to those leaders for that sense of direction, for them to commit and to be on the forefront of what needs to be done in a crisis situation. In addition to that confidence, what we're seeing here is a need for transparency and communication. And so a huge factor around any sort of effective leadership is ensuring that information is cascaded appropriately, that people are knowing the truth, and that leaders are being really honest with the current state of events. The other thing that we look for in leaders is that they're making informed decisions. Right? They're open to new ideas, they're open to advice from other people, subject matter experts, other professionals, so they can make the right decisions that are going to lead to the best outcomes. And then finally, these leaders, they're present, they're engaged, they're visible. So they're attending not just to the physical needs of their people, but the emotional needs as well. They're ready, they're available to connect with, and that does a lot in terms of opening up that trust and rapport. So we're not just talking about our global leaders now, we're talking about leaders within organizations as well, and how they navigate these really tumultuous times so that their teams, employees are feeling engaged, they're feeling motivated, and then they feel like they're being led effectively. We're going to come back for these 5 later on in the webinar. So the first big idea I want to introduce this afternoon is this. It's just as important to recognize and address the counterproductive behaviors that lead to negative impacts on leadership effectiveness during a crisis. So it's all good and well to look for the things that we want and that we need, but we need to be mindful of the behaviors that are actually going to distract leaders from that effective leadership. So what is the impact of poor leadership? At Peterberry, we use the LEAP model to draw the link very explicitly between leadership practice and performance. So it starts with leadership, and that can come down to preferences, style, behavior, explicit choices, but how an individual decides to lead and what their leadership style is. And that has a direct impact on engagement. So there's a amount of research out there that shows the explicit link between different leadership styles and employee engagement in organizations. Now, obviously, with engagement, that in and of itself has a whole range of interconnections with things like employee turnover, sense of work satisfaction, productivity, safety behavior, etc. It also has an impact on agility. So the way that a person leads actually lays the groundwork for how agile an organization is, how readily they are going to respond to changing environments, ambiguity, how aware the organization is and how committed they are to responding to a whole range of different factors that may be very novel or unexplored previously. And then finally, all of this linking to overall business performance. So at its core, leadership impacts engagement and agility, and that impacts on the organization's performance. So you can see here a poor leader, a leader that isn't leading effectively, that's going to result in disengagement. Employees are not going to be able to feel connected to the vision or the strategy. They may feel a little bit lost. Their psychological safety may also be at stake. Ineffective leadership can lead to I suppose a pause in agility. That can lead to rigidity. It can lead to adherence to more traditional ways and more conservative ways of operating. And that's at the end going to impact on broader performance, and they're going to remain behind the curve when everybody else and their competitors are moving ahead. So the next big idea I want to introduce today is this: a leader's day-to-day strengths are not always indicative of how they are going to respond in a crisis. Right? So if you think about a leader on their good day, they're operating their best, they're showing their strengths, they're doing really well, they're doing all the right things. Yes, it's predictive of how they're likely to generally operate for the most part, but we need to remember that a crisis situation is very different from BAU. It's very different from a normal operating style. And so what we need to understand is that just because a leader has been operating one way day to day when things are going well, doesn't mean they're going to demonstrate those same sorts of behaviors and remain as effective when faced with crisis. So here at PBC, and as the distributors for the Hogan personality assessments, the way that we try to understand whether a person is going to respond equally in good times and the bad times is getting a bit more of a perspective around their personality and what their personality looks like during the bright times, as well as what that personality looks like when under stress or pressure. So you think about that day-to-day behavior. All the things that we want to see in leaders on their best days. It is the bright side, it's their everyday behavior, it's their day-to-day reputation. What we also look like is the value, so the inside of the leader, the drivers, the things that motivate them, and how do their values actually align with the decisions that they make and what they place importance on. But what we're going to explore in a bit more detail today is what I like to call the dark side. Now, we all have the dark side, right? We all have this side of us that comes out when we're not at our best, when we're tired, we're fatigued, there's a lot on, the stakes are really high. And so with any sort of crisis situation, inevitably leaders, individuals are going to be feeling an extra level of stress and pressure. And so it goes to show that this dark side tendency is inevitably going to showing up perhaps a lot more often than normally. So how do leaders respond in crises? Well, they respond in crises the same way that they respond in any situation when they are stressed, uncomfortable, or outside of their normal operating rhythm. So in these situations, what our research and what Hogan's research has shown is that leaders generally derail, that is, they demonstrate certain counterproductive behaviors in broadly 3 different ways. The first way that leaders tend to derail or perhaps operate when they are stressed is they move away. So they move away, they run from the problem, they hide, they become defensive. Right. So very much like this cute little hedgehog we've got here on the screens, they become very unapproachable, right? The defensiveness, walls comes up, they're hard to console. There might be individuals or leaders who prefer to get their own space, disconnect and move away from other people in order to manage those stresses. The other way that Hogan's research suggests that leaders and individuals deal with stress is they move against. So they charge at the problem. They combat others. Maybe those people are the problem. And so for them, it's really digging in, putting their feet firmly on the ground and pushing back expecting to get results, expecting to get outcomes, and charging ahead, perhaps with very little concern of the impact that is potentially having on the relationships and the interactions with the people around them. So a little bit more like a bull approach to dealing with stress. Final way that we find that leaders deal with stress is that they move towards people. So they get close to the problem. They get so involved in what's in front of them and the tactical aspect of the issue that it can lead to micromanagement tendencies or an over attention to maybe unnecessary detail. And so what you tend to find with leaders here is that they're so concerned about doing a good job that they lose sight of the bigger picture. Right? They get stuck in the weeds. So 3 broad ways that we see leaders derail. They move away, they move against, or they move towards. So a little bit more about this dark side of personality. Where does it come from and why is it useful to look at? So the dark side of our personality is really those behaviors that adversely affect your performance or reputation at work. So that's what we're defining as a derailer here. And often these behaviors are caused by an individual or leader's distorted beliefs about how other people are going to treat them, and most commonly emerge in moments of stress or complacency. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. In terms of where they develop, these are tendencies that often reflect behavior learned in early childhood, right? So these aren't just behaviors developed now as adults, they have been embedded in us as we have developed and as we experience and navigate the world through our early childhood. And these behaviors are learned because they are rewarded in some way, shape, or form. And often the behaviors are learned in response to how maybe parents or others have reacted to those behaviors. And finally, the behavior persists through to adulthood because it has led to some short-term wins. So a very crude example may be, you know, when I'm stressed or when I want something and I'm unfiltered as a toddler, and I have a 2.5-year-old, so I'm kind of sharing a bit of my own experience here, but they're unfiltered. They don't care about what other people think. They don't need to manage themselves. So when they want something, she might shout and yell to get what she wants. Now, if that behavior is rewarded and that shouting and yelling gets her that lolly or gets her that chocolate, well, that's the reward. And the response from the people around them is, here's the reward, here, stop crying, please stop yelling. And that then persists into, you know, adolescence and adulthood. So when I'm at work, in order to get what I want, I need to be the loudest voice in the room. I need to stand my ground, and that's how I'm going to get the outcomes that I'm looking for. All right. So you can almost think about the dark side as our unfiltered selves, and that filter comes down either due to a crack because of the amount of pressure that we're under, or it comes down voluntarily because we just stop caring and we become complacent. So in summary, those derailing behaviors often yield short-term wins, short-term payoffs, but might result in longer-term reputational damage. They can erode relationships, erode trust, and often they're unconscious, right? People are not always aware of the dark side of their personality and the impact that's having, especially as a leader. One way to make this conscious is to get that external feedback, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. But just because a leader is aware of these tendencies doesn't mean that they're going to stop. So we'll talk a little bit about how we manage that as well. All right. So the third idea I want to introduce for this afternoon is this. All derailers are counterproductive. So moving away, moving against, moving towards, there are elements within all of those tendencies that are going to lead to counterproductive behavior and reputational damage. But During a crisis and when leading through crisis, there are some dark side tendencies that are more detrimental than others. So how do we determine what those specific behaviors probably are? Well, let's go back to the 5 look for behaviors that we explored earlier. Leaders that are calm and resilient, that take the initiative and are proactive, that are transparent and communicative, that make informed decisions and are present, engaged, and visible. So what you'll find is that, well, the opposite of this, right? So leaders who are panicky, reactive, emotionally driven, and then perhaps volatile, leaders who may not show that same tenacity or persistent in the face of adversity. That's the opposite of what we're looking for. When you consider the opposite of taking the initiative and being proactive, well, it's a passive response to leading other people. It's governed by fear, a fear of failure, a fear of doing the wrong thing, and can lead to a lack of assertiveness or decisiveness when during a crisis. This is exactly what we need, that courage, the determination, and that decisiveness. When we look at the opposite of transparent and communicative leadership styles, well, you tend to find that it's more around being reserved, withholding, not sharing that information, not connecting, not communicating broadly with the business or your team. Maybe withholding critical information. The opposite here of informed decision making is resistant and dismissive. So not showing that open disposition when it comes to new ideas or other information, right? Maybe making up your mind based on certain assumptions and then appearing quite resistant to new ideas or feedback that is coming your way. And the final one, just in terms of being present and engaged and visible, what we see here is disconnected, distant, unavailable, unapproachable. So what does the personality research suggest? When we consider the personality characteristics and some of the research we've done into the dark side of personality, there is this concept or dimension called excitable. And excitable is essentially the propensity to respond emotionally, quite reactive, and maybe lack that persistent when a person is not managing themselves well. So when under stress, pressure, or during a crisis. And that can lead to a lot of this panicky and reactive behavior. The next thing our personality research shows is that people who are highly skeptical. Now, there is a difference between appropriate skepticism and counterproductive skepticism. So appropriate skepticism is questioning things, verifying, making sure that you're alert for what's going on beneath the surface. But when skepticism starts to turn more towards cynicism, maybe forming certain assumptions regardless of what information is coming your way, well, that can come across as resistant, dismissive, and argumentative. The next one here shows that this element of being cautious is really related to more passive and fearful tendencies, right? So I'm scared to fail. I'm fearful of exposing my vulnerabilities, and hence I may not courageously go after a particular opportunity or make a certain decision for fear of exposing my weaknesses. The other way we see leaders derail, and what our research suggests, is that being reserved can promote a style of withholding information, not being as proactive in terms of communicating your ideas or communicating critical information. A lot of the thinking is happening up there, but not much of it is being soundboarded or dispersed. In addition to that, we find that highly reserved leaders, when they're not their best selves, can appear disconnected, distant, and this is so critical, especially given the situation now where we're no longer physically co-located in our offices and in our teams. That risk of being disconnected, distant, and unavailable is exacerbated. And then finally, this characteristic that we describe as leisurely. Now, leisurely behavior is essentially comprised of maybe appearing openly agreeable, saying what other people want you to say, right? But on the inside, it's this passive aggressive tendency. It's doing what you want. I like to describe it as maybe beating to your own drum a little bit. And when overextended, and when presenting as a dark side behavior, it can come across as withholding, right? You may say one thing, I don't agree, I'm not necessarily going to confront you about it, but I'm definitely not going to adjust my behavior. So I'm just going to keep doing what I do. And that can also appear resistant and dismissive. I do what I want. So, excitable, skeptical, cautious, reserved, and leisurely. And what we find is when we look back at the research, when we look back at those 5 components of what we want to see in leaders, this is the dark side. This is actually what's going to cause leaders to fail from a personality perspective. So that isn't the end, right? It isn't to say, right, well, if this is your natural disposition, this is who you are, well, then you're going to fail as a leader. I think we all have our different styles and tendencies. In terms of why leaders fail, it goes beyond just having these tendencies and characteristics. I think it goes a lot towards what a leader decides to actually do about it. So the question I pose for you, whether you're currently a leader within an organization, whether you've recognized some of these tendencies in yourself when you are under a lot of stress or pressure, maybe you're a consultant or a coach and you're working with some leaders who you've known and experienced some of these tendencies from, or maybe you're in a supportive role within your businesses. What are you currently doing to better understand how your leaders respond in a crisis? How are you getting that information up front, earlier rather than later? Has your experience and understanding of how a leader manages through a crisis left till they are actually in a crisis, and by that point it's a little bit too late? Or are you putting in place measures when you're hiring, selecting, promoting, and developing your leaders to gain a bit more of this understanding so you can get ahead of the potential issues? So, how do managers or leaders typically manage their dark side tendencies? Well, one way is this. It's called idiosyncrasy credit. And at its core, what it suggests is that being seen as an effective leader day to day is going to create this idiosyncrasy credit. And idiosyncrasy credit is essentially all of that goodwill. It is all of those little things that you do day to day that have built up a really positive reputation. So in those moments where maybe you slip up, you drop the ball, it's easily forgiven, right? It's easily forgiven and forgotten because people know that generally speaking, you're unlikely to behave that way. So obviously something must be up. There must be some sort of unusual situations for why you're behaving in a particular way. So a great quote from Mark Twain describes this really nicely. He who is known as an early riser can stay in until noon. Another wise man also said, I can't wear a pink shirt to work. Everybody wears white shirts. I'm not popular enough to be different. So that's one way we tend to find leaders managing some of their dark side tendencies. It gets pushed aside, forgotten, forgiven because they do a lot of good when they're at their best. Now that might work in instances where there are momentary stress points, momentary pressure points, but we're living in a very different environment now where that stress and pressure is probably going to extend far longer than usual. And there's going to be a lot more complexity and a lot more moving parts given the way that we're operating now. So what I would say is a more effective way that leaders can manage their dark side is through strategic self-awareness. Strategic self-awareness. And what this does is that it enables self-management by identifying problematic behaviors, some of those counterproductive behaviors, identifying what the triggers for those particular behaviors are, and then moving towards developing strategies to control or to manage those problematic behaviors. So notice here that it isn't just self-awareness, because as we've already discussed, just being aware of these behaviors isn't going to change how the leader deals with the situation. So, with regards to strategic self-awareness, a question I pose is this: how are you or your organization enhancing your leaders' strategic self-awareness? So what are you doing as a business support? What are you doing as a leader of leaders? What are you doing as a coach or a consultant to help and support your leaders who maybe don't have this level of strategic self-awareness? Maybe they are self-aware, maybe they know this about themselves, but they haven't really moved to action doing anything about it. So my fourth and final big idea for this afternoon is that strategic self-awareness is the key to enabling tactical self-management. Strategic self-awareness enables tactical self-management. So here's what you can do to create that strategic self-awareness and manage those dark side tendencies. The first, define the reputation that you want to have as a leader, or help your leaders define the reputation that they want to have. Now, this is so critical because what it does is it creates a sense of what's in it for me. If you can have a leader define what their purpose is, who they want to be described as, who they want to be known for in the good times and the bad, how do they want to be described when this pandemic starts to ease and we slowly start to get back to a normal operating rhythm? You know, how do they want to be described in terms of how they manage that? Getting them to define that, describe that explicitly is such an important and powerful anchor point, because then everything else flows from that. So then you can identify problematic behavior, and there's a few ways that you can do this. One way is to use valid psychometric assessments, so personality assessments that are going to predict how a person is going to behave and how they interact with the world, highlighting some of their strengths as well as their potential counterproductive behaviors. The second way to do that is through 360 feedback or multi-rater feedback, and that's a really powerful way to get some real life observations anonymously from the people around that individual or that leader. And together with personality data as well as 360 data, it's a really great way to cover all of those bases in terms of predicting how a person is going to behave, as well as how well they're currently managing some of those tendencies in front of their relevant stakeholders. And the other way to do that is just to get real-time feedback from others, whether that's, you know, off the back of a call, at the end of the project, day to day. So yes, we might not be able to walk out of a meeting room together physically and have a bit of a chat, but after your Zoom calls, after your virtual team meetings, where are those opportunities to debrief and say, look, I observed this, the impact of that behavior was this, what could we do differently next time? Or as a leader, how can you then be more proactive in reaching out and soliciting that feedback? So when the virtual conference is over, reconnecting for 5 minutes on another call saying, hey, what did you think? How did I go? What did I do well? What do you think I could have improved on? How can I do things differently? But identifying that problematic behavior and getting some real actionable data is so critical to the strategic component of self-awareness. The next here is determining the triggers for the behavior. So yes, broadly, stress, pressure, fatigue, complacency can be broader situational catalysts for our dark side tendencies. But you may find that for some people, it's dealing with ambiguity. That's what triggers certain behaviors. For others, it's incompetent team members. That's what really gets them. For other people, it's just a lack of clarity in terms of expectations, or just the erratic way that things are being done at the moment, and the lack of stability, whatever it is. But uncovering what the triggers are for those behaviors, what has led to the leader behaving that way in that particular situation, is another powerful element. Fourthly, recognizing the impact of the problematic behavior on things like employee engagement, team performance, their own reputation as a leader, as well as other business outcomes. Right? So it comes back to that LEAP model. Leadership drives engagement, drives performance, and what sort of impact is their poor behavior, their disconnection, maybe their skepticism, their emotionality, or their hyper caution having on how their teams function, their level of engagement, and how they are then perceived as a leader moving forward. And then finally, and most importantly, developing practical actions that will help manage the behavior. And often when I'm coaching individuals in managing their dark side tendencies, every single action, everything that they put into their development plan needs to connect back to that very first point around who they want to be as a leader. Because if there isn't that connection point, then there's no meaning. It's a tick box, it's a nice to have, it's what other people want me to do. But when a leader starts to connect the dots between who they want to be, how their behavior is either helping or hindering them in achieving that reputation, then they become a lot more focused, targeted, and committed to the actions that they put in place and the strategies that they develop. So, in summary, why do leaders fail? Why do they fail during a crisis? Well, at the end of the day, it is a lot to do with some of those darker side tendencies being left unmanaged and unaccounted for. Right? We're in really difficult, complex situations now, and it means that the opportunity for these to rear their heads are a lot more often. Secondly, there is just reliance on these habitual behaviors, these things that maybe throughout their career, day to day, have allowed them to get those short-term wins. So they just keep doing it and relying on it. And they don't have that level of strategic self-awareness. They don't have the mechanisms or the strategies in place to be able to manage these behaviors effectively. So the takeaways today are that we all have these dark side tendencies. We all deal with stress and pressure and crises in a number of different ways. And yes, our research suggests that that moving away tendency is probably one of the most detrimental styles in terms of the impact it has on leading through these difficult times. But that doesn't mean that just because you have these tendencies and preferences that the buck stops there. The question then is, what do you do about it, right? What are you putting in play so that you're continuing to be effective during these times? So, to end our webinar, or the formal component of our webinar today, a few things to consider. The first, a leader's day-to-day reputation and behavior during the good times is not always going to be predictive of how they operate or lead during a crisis, or when they're under stress, pressure. It is so critical to understand how a leader is likely to respond when under stress and pressure, when they're feeling like they're backed into a corner, when the stakes are really high. So essentially understanding and getting data around their dark side. Thirdly, we know that leaders derail in a whole range of different ways, but moving away during a crisis is going to have the biggest impact in terms of poor leadership. Gathering data and feedback is so crucial for developing that strategic self-awareness. Right? So get sophisticated around it, get some real-time data, get a metric that you can lean on. And finally, it's not enough for leaders to just be aware of these behaviors. They need to understand the impact that it's having. They need to be able to understand the triggers for those behaviors so that they can put in place practical strategies to manage the behavior moving forward. So as we wrap up for this afternoon, I want to leave you with a quote from Franklin Roosevelt back in his 1933 inaugural address. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. There are many ways in which it can be helped, but it can never be helped merely by talking about it. We must act and act quickly." So that concludes the formal content of the webinar. I hope at the very least it's sparked some reflections, whether you're a leader who's wanting to think a bit more about how you manage and lead your teams through these times, whether you're a support function within your businesses who is helping talent and leadership and developing them, whether you're a consultant or an external coach, and how this has potentially helped you in terms of better understanding the implications of why leaders may not be as effective during these moments of crises. Okay, so I'll park it there, and if you have along the way added any questions, or you want to spend a couple of minutes or seconds now just popping in a few of your questions into the chat function, I'll do my best to answer any questions you have to the best of my ability.
So first up, Yisam has asked, when it comes to the derailers, is that something that can be predicted or indicated by doing something like a personality profile before employment?
Excellent question, and the easy answer to that, Yisam, is absolutely. So Peter Berry Consultancy is in the business of personality. So when we talk about the bright side, the inside and the dark side of personality, that dark side component is something that we use as a way to predict how a person is going to derail when they're not their best selves. The reason that so many of our clients find it really helpful is that an interview will say something about an individual, but if you think about what an interview is, it's an opportunity for a person to put their best foot forward. So obviously they're not going to show their dark side. It's once they've been in the role 6, 12 months, 18 months where you start to see some of these derailment tendencies. And what the HDS, or the Hogan Development Survey, does is that it helps you understand what those behaviors are probably going to be and the impact they're going to have on leadership, on teams, on culture. So it's absolutely something that we not only do, but would absolutely recommend as part of any sort of talent acquisition strategy.
Lauren Gatt from Voice Project has asked, so if you can't move towards, against, or away from a problem, is the alternative to move with the problem?
That's an interesting take. I think, and there's further research around the dark side. One way we describe dark side tendencies is that they are often an overuse of strength. They're an overused strength. So maybe too much of a good thing, right? You like chocolate a little bit at a time, but you're going to feel pretty ill if you're going to smash a whole chocolate cake in one sitting because there's too much of it. So rather than the moving with the problem, I would suggest here that the way that individuals manage their dark side is to look at what those tendencies are and then balance them out so that they are operating in their favor instead of against them. So what I mean by that is, if we take the example of moving away, people who retract, pull away, disconnect at their worst, but the strength, when all of that is well managed and well balanced, suggests that these are individuals who are alert. They're aware of what could go wrong. They're not making any unnecessary mistakes. They're being really considerate about the consequences of their actions, and they're ensuring that at the end of the day, they're alert for what could go wrong, and they're focused on what needs to happen. They're not getting distracted by what's going on around them. So it's all about bringing balance to the table. If we take the moving against example, the bulls in the china shop, right? The people who push and assert themselves to the point of appearing arrogant or overconfident or argumentative. When brought into balance, these tendencies are incredibly helpful for leaders to stand out, right? To be noticed. These are the people who you listen to, whether you want to or not. Their voices are heard. So for the individuals who may not have those natural tendencies, bringing a bit more of that into the conversation, into engagement is important. For people who do too much of it, what can they do to present a bit more humility, listen to other people, take a bit more of a back seat so that they're seen as more collaborative. Finally, if we look at the moving away tendency, it's again creating balance there. So as a strength, when you're managing it well, these are going to help you attend to the details, enforce structure, be organized, be reliable and dependable. It's only when you overuse those that it starts to look like micromanagement, where it starts to look like so concerned about irrelevant details, getting stuck in the weeds and maybe relying too much on consensus to the point where it becomes indecisive. So hopefully that answered your question. So I think when you do bring balance to those things, it is a way for you to move with the problem in terms of how you approach and address the issues in a constructive way.
Yisam has also asked, how would you recommend balancing calm and resilience with showing vulnerability and authentic emotion during a crisis that does have personal impact?
Absolutely. And there's some research and articles written, in fact, that look at the counterproductivity of resilient leaders. And so your point is absolutely valid in that go too far to the extreme end of calmness and resilience, and the leader is going to appear so optimistic and so self-assured that people wonder whether they actually know what's happening and whether they're aware of what's going on around them. They can come across as aloof, they can come across as unemotional and lacking that sort of passion and sense of urgency. So when it comes to balancing those things out, when we talked about things like excitable, that's when it gets overplayed. But when we balance that excitability, that emotionality, that sense of urgency and that sense of energy, well, that's where we get that authenticity. People don't get frustrated by things that they don't care about. So leaders still need to show an appropriate level of emotionality and sense of urgency to get things done and to move things forward. They just need to be careful that if they happen to be a leader who has the propensity to be excitable or overly passionate or overly emotive, that's a very fine line to walk. And so you're absolutely right, it is about bringing that balance. How do you do that? Well, it comes back to that strategic self-awareness. What has been the impact of the positive impact of that emotionality? What's been the negative impact of emotionality? What was different in those situations, and how did your emotions and your authenticity and your transparency work for you? Where might that have shot you in the foot a little bit? And I think it's just through that level of exploration, coaching, and development where you can reach some of those reflection points and then move to action and clear strategy.
One last question so far. In times like this, when cash flow is king, how can we ensure that organizations don't lose their focus or commitment to leadership development as one of the key levers for combating a downturn?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research at the moment that looks at the explicit benefits of investing in development, in talent during a downturn. Right? Now, yes, the research suggests that, and the science is the science. But the reality is that organizations are going to be governed by hygiene factors, right? And so they're not always going to have the explicit budget or the dollars to invest in the same way that they might have typically done so in the good seasons. But to your point, I think it's important to reframe the conversation. So it's not about throwing money into developing your talent. It's about showing your talent that you're still concerned about their development. Now, that might not necessarily mean in this climate that there's going to be a 6-month leadership development program that they're going to be attending or being facilitated, but that could mean that, hey, here are some webinars, here are some thought leadership, here's some things that I think you might find helpful. Come along, I'll go with you. Let's have a debrief off the back of that and talk a little bit more, right? As leaders within the business, it is your responsibility as well to spend your time not just fighting fires, but actually investing in your team, and that's going to result in higher levels of engagement. If an organization is going through periods of stand downs, redundancies, turnovers, and reduction in headcount, all of that is going to have an impact on people's level of security, especially if they're hypersensitive to that. It's going to have an impact on their motivation levels. Their team dynamics are going to change as a result. So how can you day to day continue to invest in them at an individual level without necessarily going through more formal development programs? And I think that is, it's not something that leaders need to do just during these moments of crisis. It's something that they should be doing regardless as a day-to-day behavior. I think it's also important in all of that, developing staff is something that leaders need to be held accountable for, right? It should be part of their KPIs. It should be something that they are measured against, because essentially what gets measured gets done. And so what are you doing and what are you putting in place to ensure that that is positioned as just as important as some of the other operational aspects of how a leader is performance managed or reviewed. Were there any other questions?
I think that's everything for today.
All right. So a couple of things before we wrap up for this afternoon. Firstly, just want to say thank you again for joining us today for the webinar. Hopefully you found it informative and sparked some reflections in yourself. We have a whole range of other thought leadership webinars and qualification webinars that are completely complimentary. So stay tuned, be on the lookout. We'll be giving some details for those along the way. If gathering data and using that has been something that you're thinking seriously about in terms of helping promote that strategic self-awareness in your leaders, next Tuesday, so the 14th of April, we have a Hogan 360 Masterclass being facilitated by our very own Peter Berry. So in that session, he's going to just share a little bit more information around some of our 2020 benchmark insights. So when we look at, how leaders look by industry, by sector, by job level, what are the sort of key takeaways there of how leaders are currently operating? What's best practice in terms of utilizing a tool like a 360? And so that's going to be really helpful, I think, for those of you who are either familiar and have been using the 360 assessment, or for those of you who are considering making this a part of your talent management and talent development practices. Absolutely come along. Peter's a very charismatic, interesting character. He's got a lot of cool stories and anecdotes, and above all, a lot of experience in this space. So I think definitely worth getting to. So that's next Tuesday, the 14th of April, if you want. But other than that, look, thank you again. Enjoy the Easter break ahead of you. Rest up, be healthy, be well, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.